It kept going. Excellent. I don't know why I went twice, but that's all good. All right, I have an echo. Is it from you?
I don't think so. At least I'm not hearing anything.
It's me. I got it. Sorry.
Okay.
Apologize. Hi, everybody. This is the third episode in our platform thinking series. Today, I'm really excited to have Mario Platt with us. Mario and I have hung out a bunch of times in various formats. I don't think we've ever spoken face-to-face, but we've talked a lot on Twitter, DMs. We share some interests in security issues, socio-technical systems theory, socio-technical architecture ideas, resilience engineering and resilience theory, complexity theory. So I think it'll be a really fun conversation today. Mario, do you want to introduce yourself to everybody?
Yep, sounds good. So my name is Mario Platt. I've been I got interested in security when I was 13 years old. This was back in the late 90s. And I've been working in security-related fields since about early 2000s. So I started as a penetration tester. I have more than 10 years of experience in security engineering and operations. And since about 2014, that I've been mostly focusing on governance, risk, and compliance. But I made sure to keep my kind of DevOps, DevSecOps type skill set. And I still do related work. So for the past 5-6 years, I've been doing a lot of reading and not sure I'd call it research, but into kind of safety science, resilience engineering, and some other areas, thinking about how we can do security differently.
Cool.
And that's also the name of my blog, securitydifferently.com.
Excellent. Cool. So just to start out with, I like to ask everybody to kind of get an idea of framing the conversation. What do you think a platform is? How should people be thinking about when they say they're going to design a platform or think about a platform or engineer a platform? What is it that they're pointing at, or what is it that you think of they're pointing at?
So generally speaking, I think a big challenge that I see is how people overlay the ideas of platform onto something that we previously called an infrastructure, right? And sometimes it's very easy to kind of to confuse the two. For me, when I think about a platform, I'm thinking that it's a set of things that are ultimately should give me two main outcomes. One of them is abstracting the horizontal needs that exist at infrastructure and building of systems level across an organization. So everything that is kind of horizontal, and making sure that those things are made available in a way that are easily consumable by the people that have to use them to build products and services. In the second one, which relates more to security, but also to quality assurance, in my opinion, overall, which is it should be a way to establish also guardrails into what is permitted and permissible within the context of the variability that is going to exist, because you've got different teams doing different things, right? So for me, those are the two main outcomes, right? Abstracting things that people should know about in order for them to be self-sufficient and be have a good experience as consumers of something else that someone is providing for them. In the second part around the guardrails.
Yeah, cool. So I think, the way that I've talked about that in the past is it's kind of like a cross-cutting or orthogonal concern. And I usually call them the illities. Security doesn't end in an illity, but many of the things do. Many of those cross-cutting concerns end in an illity, reliability, things like that. Yep. So when you think about these cross-cutting concerns, does that differentiate a platform in your mind from other kind of software development activities, because it's kind of like a broad concern as opposed to a narrow concern? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. So I think, again, that will always depend a lot on context, right? Mm-hmm. Because there are some contexts in which things that can be leveraged more than other things, right? So, for instance, an example: if you've got 10 product teams that work on a particular product, but things are very tightly coupled, then the ability to leverage some testing across all of the teams, etc., will be bigger. As opposed if you've got a team that they're loosely coupled in most of the things that they do, and obviously they have much more specific needs to their own thing, as opposed to making sense from an economical perspective to provide something at the platform level that can satisfy the needs of the constituents.
Yeah.
So I think it really depends on
Yeah.
that, I think.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, I mean, there was two other things that I thought about when you were talking, but the first one that I wanted to kind of poke at a little bit more is, so like, because you've been doing kind of security, governance, risk, and compliance, like your view on platforms is really more of an operations view, I would think, right? Like you think more as an operator than as a developer. Is that
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Yeah.
And so, I mean, do platforms do operators need different things out of platforms than say product teams need out of platforms? Like if a
Oh,
development
good
team
question.
versus an operator team, like there's so much focus these days when we in the platform conversation about kind of I call it developer supremacy, like everything's for the developer, which is a little bit of your first comment, right?
Yep.
Like, what is it like? If is there uh, this other persona involved in the design called an operator, and what kind of things should people think about when they think about operations of platforms?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Again, I see both ends of the spectrum, right? And I really think it's a spectrum. On one hand, you've got kind of previously called infrastructure teams that still have that much the approach that we saw in the late 90s, early 2000s, which is, look, my server is going to take 3 weeks to build. You're going to have to wait, and that's it, right? I'm doing my thing at my pace, and you're going to have to wait for me to do my thing at my pace, right?
Yep.
And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got that, look, it's the developers that we need all to subordinate to the needs of the things, right? And I think there's a spectrum there. That part of the challenge is figuring out where you as an organization need to be along that spectrum. But particularly now when we are largely in a cloud-based world where there's a lot of assurances already provided by some of the services that we consume and that we build our software services on top, I think particularly as we increase things such as regulations and requirements for compliance, etc., that really becomes, I think, the level of what we need to think about in terms of the things that are really required to be reproducible and that are required to be consumed in an easy way. So from an operator perspective, I don't know if you're using Kubernetes and have a sidecar type of deployments, right? Making sure that all of your monitoring stacks and all your auditing functions, etc., can be provided on a sidecar, for someone can just easily consume that within your Kubernetes cluster, for instance, is something that would very much help the operators, right, in making sure that they've got something repeatable and to consume. And again, they can just be another set of stakeholders saying, look, we want to have this consistent view across the organization. This is another vehicle, the platform level, to kind of drive that consistency into observability and other things.
Yeah, cool. So like the other thing I was thinking about when you were talking, because it's kind of language that that would be used in, I think, in kind of resilience theory, definitely in complexity theory, was like these ideas of like creating attractors and using enabling constraints, right? So creating attractors to me is like figuring out how to make the platform in a way that has the right level of cognitive load. Like you don't want too much because people get confused by it, but you don't want to be so simple that nobody thinks about it at all. They just use it, right? You want this kind of middle ground where they're curious about it, they play with it a little bit, like stuff like that. So I think that's interesting. But the other one is kind of governing or enabling constraints, right? Like, and one of the things that when I so people have this really negative reaction usually when you say constraints, right? They say like, oh, you can't constrain me, right? But of course, the whole idea, I think, of enabling constraints is that the appropriate set of enabling constraints accelerates people. It doesn't slow them down. So when I'm sure you have heard this as a security person. I've heard it when I've talked around people who talk about security, like security is slowing us down. It's making everything more difficult. like when people are thinking about platforms and security and these constraints, like how should they be thinking through or talking to other people about how that works?
Yep, that's a very great comment, and I really like the way you framed the question. So let me give you an example. Let's say, for instance, an organization decides to implement a new static code analysis tool, right? And so the problem that we had, and it's a problem that a lot of security people still are not really completely familiar with the concept of product management, right? And how we're not talking waterfall, things are being managed differently. But that's a way of organizing work. It's not necessarily one thing that is only for software people, right? It's a way of organizing work and organizing feedback loops and how you're going to elicit information that is required for you to know that you're doing right by your clients, right? Whether they're internal or external. And I think largely the security community has been missing that boat. So going back to my point, a lot of kind of more traditional security teams, they really focus on getting the budget for the static analysis tool and then kind of doing a POC, doing an initial integration, and then telling developers, look, here's the tool, here are some things on how you use them. Let me know if you've got problems, right? And that's it, right? That is not what is a platform level capability, right? A platform level capability needs to be something that not only are you have a social network that is keeping the conversation alive, right? You've got a good product management in that you've got someone whose job is to get feedback from the people that are using the products. Their job is to figure out when you're starting to build something. Don't go for Rolls Royce on day one. You go to an MVP, you get feedback, you iterate, you improve the level of what that is. You make sure that people can use tools within their context, right? So if you've got need to deal with false positives, don't ask people to log into a different portal to do something completely different, because you're taking them out of their context. They're going to hate it, right? That's so it's all of those things that are, look, if you're managing things on as code with your IDEs, with all of that, we should think about how can we provide the level of security capabilities to operate at that level, right? Close to the context of the user, right? And that's something that I think has largely been missed. So we keep on getting more technology, more vendors, and better security tools, but we haven't really figured out how to integrate this into platform level capabilities that can be leveraged by multiple teams, and what it takes to keep them up to date and the conversation alive, and keep iterating to provide a good support so that people know what to do with them.
Yeah, interesting. So I think, when a lot of people think about platforms in relationship to security, especially kind of like DevOps or operational things, their minds tend to drift towards CI/CD and container scanning and package scanning and all these kind of SBOM type things and stuff like that. But you were kind of pointing more, again, exposing a certain level of complexity directly to the developers to give them more traction, like so to give them some insights in an IDE or in their process. Am I getting that right? That we need to and do you have any examples of like how people should think about allowing their developers to develop these expertise in security and thinking about security? Because I think it's great that we're doing these scans, right? And that we do build scans and stuff like that, but it's always in some ways it's still a delayed feedback loop, right? It's not like in my IDE when it's highlighting this line's not going to compile, right? Like how is that the ideal is to get it so that people can more readily see more immediately where they're creating potential vulnerabilities and things like that? Is that how I should think about that?
So I have mixed feelings on that because I think there are, again, there's a spectrum between different things. So to give you an example, using static analysis as an example, we see a lot in organizations that because of compliance reasons and the kind of the normal kind of credo that we all get indoctrinated when we work as a security professional, we tend to create processes like a static code analysis process. Right? The thing is, in the real world, the world of a developer, that's not a thing.
Yeah, that's
Right?
right. Yeah.
That doesn't exist. It's not something that the developer stops doing the development to do this static thing and then he moves on to the next process, right? That does
Right.
not exist in the real world.
Yep.
What exists is a dynamic work in the static code analysis thing. Shares it has a time sharing capability with operational stuff, with development stuff, right?
Yeah.
And the thing is, once you understand that the process that we wrote is not how the real world operates, then that puts us in a different type of mindset, which
Yeah.
is actually you're not in the business of issuing reports on security, you're in the issue of attention management
Yeah. Interesting.
out
Yeah.
of a bunch of stuff that is being bombarded as feedback from CI/CD. So
Yeah.
if you don't understand everything that is competing for the attention of a developer when they receive the feedback from the multitude of tools that they get when they submit code in a CI/CD system, then you don't actually know what's going on and you don't know how to affect any of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think like the classic version of that, right, that most developers would get is like when we used to program in Java, if you didn't keep up with the warnings, eventually you just ignored all the warnings because it just works, right? Like
Mhm.
it's just a warning; it doesn't really matter. And it makes me think of this great story. So Drift into Failure, the
Yep.
Decker book is great, and in that book he kind of describes this idea that there was a plane that was particularly bad at falling out of the sky, and part of the reason was it had two bolts that went into the whatever they call the rudder in the back. I can't name that thing, but it would run fine with just one bolt, like most of the time. And so he gets it. He kind of explains this idea that says that what ends up happening with engineers that are maintaining the planes is they learn that it works most of the time,
Yep.
and so they just don't pay any attention to it. They don't even notice that it's not there anymore, right? It's just like not part of their conscious kind of engagement. So, when we think about this kind of attention management or kind of cognitive engineering, is that what you when you say things like safety differently? Are these the types of ideas that you're trying to point out to people? The kind of like
Yeah.
shaping of focus and things like that.
Yeah, so generally it's two things. The first one is understanding that most of the security literature out there kind of assumes a pretty kind of static world, a Newtonian Cartesian type world where effect has a cause has an effect, and an effect always has a cause, and we've got this easy way to trace back to how things happened.
Yep.
When in the real world, what a lot of this literature does is look, there are things that we know that are kind of modulators. They have an effect on the system, but we don't know exactly what is. There are things we can point our fingers to. So even in systems thinking, right, it's still at some level, it's still reductionist, right? Because
Yep.
it's still a way of us thinking and putting the world. I think this thing has this effect on that, but as humans, we're going to miss stuff. We're going to have things having effect on each other that we won't be able to cause the trace to trace the causality, right?
Yep.
And I think it's understanding that in the dynamic world, in the real world that we live in, that people are always trying to do these, manage these constraints and trade-offs, and that there will be things that will have in fact effects on security culture that we won't be able to see. Right? So, for instance, if you've got a really bad VP of engineering manager, right? Doesn't matter how good your processes are, the psychological safety and all of that thing will affect people's daily work.
Yeah.
And it's going to be very easy for us to say, oh, it's because he speaks badly to his staff that everything's wrong. It's not that simple, right? It never is, right? But you know that it has an effect.
Yeah.
So our security models are pretty much stuck in this Newtonian Cartesian way of viewing the world. So that's why I kind of started doing more research into safety science, resilience engineering, that consider that we don't always have all the answers. We can't always trace all of this, but it's still upon us to figure out how to be resilient, right? How to be able to succeed in expected and unexpected situations.
Yeah. I think, so in my PhD, I kind of refer to this idea as being ongoingness or like unfolding nature of systems, right? And one of the things, again, that I think about when I think about design, and especially in a cognitive engineering frame, is and attention is in a Newtonian world, because there can be a root cause and therefore an answer. if you give someone an answer, you don't want them to question the answer. You want them to accept the answer because you have the answer. And the system, in theory, is static, so it shouldn't change. So stop looking there. Look somewhere else. Do something different, right? It's this idea that we can progressively accumulate resilience, and that the resilience somehow resides in the system entirely, and is being built up, as opposed to this again, like this more resilience theory or complexity theory view of these things, which is no. Resilience is an activity. It's a thing that the system does, assuming you take the system as a socio-technical system, because resilience is not a thing that a technical system can do by itself.
But you would miss that, right? If you looked at everyone's selling vendors and new regulations, there's a lot of cybersecurity regulation coming up. It's all resilience. But when you look at it, it's the same thing we've been doing for 20, 30 years, right? They define 4, 5, 6 broad areas of problem, like supply chain. Then that leads you to the S-bombs, right? So all of these things that come, there's a very linear causality. This is what the regulation is going to say. This is the solution to meet that requirement, right? It's all Newtonian.
Yeah, and again, it's those governing constraints, right? Like it's adding more and more governance on whether or not that governance is helping or not is another question, right? Like,
no, it usually isn't, because it leads to, and that's a problem that we are, I think, us as an industry are facing in security, which is the something also that Deca talks a lot about, the bureaucratic entrepreneurialism in organizations, right? That so non-operational work begets non-operational work, paperwork begets paperwork, right? So when you kind of then find yourself just building a giant mountain of paperwork. So actually, Deca calls this auditism, which is that I really like to use that. I've used that in a few of my talks. So he mentions auditism as a condition where the things being audited and the methods for auditing them are kind of mirrors of themselves, right? So what ends up happening is you've got all of these things that produce a certain output that allows you to say, yes, I am compliant, but it completely misses the socio-technical work that happens underneath, right? It doesn't even look at it, right?
I thought, so, like, Kevin Bear, who's one of my good friends, did this study once, and I think it was maybe in the early 2000s, and the study that he did was he talked to, like, I think 1,000 different companies, different CIOs and CTOs and CISOs and stuff, and the study was on controls, and what they found in the study was the highest performing organizations, so the ones that had the best security operations, all these things, had the least number of controls. And the thing that he points out when he talks about that is that the reason for that is that it's just like the warning things in your compiler, right? If you focus on making clear which controls are actually going to be valuable to the organization, specifically point out something specific, then people will pay attention to them.
Correct.
If you have controls that are just kind of like, I found a book over there and it's got like 50 controls in it, so I'm just implementing every single one of them. I don't know what they mean, but now they're checked off. Again, it's kind of like it's teaching people to be a little bit like zombies as opposed to being engaged in the platform activities.
And that goes back to, so that triggers me to think about two things. So the first one is that's very consistent with the high reliability organization research that was done in the 80s, right?
That's right.
So they found exactly the same thing, that companies that had their operating point closer to boundaries of an acceptable performance tended to operate better over time and not cross that boundary, right? Because look, boundaries are socially constructed, right? People are going to have an agreement what that boundary is. That's not usually what the paper says, right? So that social boundary usually exists of let's not put an S3 bucket with confidential data on online, right? That's usually a boundary that you typically don't have to tell people, generally speaking, because if they look at the permissions, usually they will know, okay, this is wrong, I should fix that, right? But if your boundary is something like we're going to have every single thing encrypted, even if it's public, etc., etc., people will just stop paying attention. Right?
Yeah.
And the thing that happens over time that Diane Vaughan researched out of the Challenger incident is the normalization of deviance. Right.
Yeah.
So people get used to, for instance, static code analysis is a good example of something that easily deteriorates. Because when you start in a new code base, maybe you've got a 6 high severity vulnerabilities. After 6 months, maybe you've got 60, then 600, and developers keep seeing the number increase every single day because they submit code 5 times a day.
Yep.
The number keeps increasing. You still weren't hacked.
Yep.
Should they pay attention to that?
Yep.
Does it matter?
Right.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's that type of thing where thinking very mechanically about stuff like CVSS scores and all of that, and not thinking about exploitability in the context of the vulnerability. When you do a good job at kind of making people understand the context of a vulnerability, when it's safe or not safe, and when you need to stop everything you're doing and go fix that, right? You get those boundaries that people are happy to adhere to, right? And they will be the ones pushing for those boundaries to be met. When you're just coming in with a book of saying we can't have high vulnerabilities if it's on a backend system in the vulnerability that is only exploitable if the endpoint is accessible from the internet, right? You will very easily start going into that people will just hide stuff from you, right?
Yeah.
That's just what's going to happen.
Yeah. I saw this talk. I will put her name in the description because I can't remember her name right now. But she was one of the managers of data at, I think it was Twitter, and she was also like a deep diver, like compressed liquid oxygen stuff and things like that. And so her talk was roughly is similar to what you're pointing out, and she was basically saying that when you first start learning these extremely deep diving things, you tell people the opposite of what you do when they're doing shallow dives. You basically say, be afraid, like be scared, because it will keep your attention. Because the thing is, when you go deep enough, take your attention off the task for a couple minutes, and things just go very badly, very quickly. So there's this idea when you're on those edges, when you're on those boundaries, that it heightens people's awareness of certain things, right? Like it makes them kind of focus on certain aspects of the system differently. And again, it's like, to me, it's partly about that, like trying to avoid having people think somebody else thought this through, so I don't have to think it through, right? Or again, like you're saying, that kind of the idea that I've seen this over and over and again and it hasn't broken. So I had this one weird question based on that, though, which is kind of it's related in that it's a security or compliance issue that is repeated and teaches people to not pay attention to it. But it's specific to different. It's different in that seems to be a series of compliance issues in certain organizations like banks where there's no remediation. You can be in violation of the fact that you have a vulnerability, but there's no remediation for the vulnerability. So you just keep on getting tagged every month in the report for having a certain number of open vulnerabilities that you haven't done anything about, but also there's nothing you can do about them right now. They're just identified as vulnerabilities. How should people manage these? How should people manage the attention to vulnerabilities and what is that? How would that work better or worse with a kind of a platform approach?
Yep. So again, thinking of platform more as something embedded in the socio-technical system as opposed to something that we do outside of it. So David Provan, he was a student of DECA and also a researcher in Australia. He has this concept that I use a lot, differentiating the work of security from the security of work. Right. And I think that's usually something that I like to bring about, because it kind of sets us in the right path to think about what it is that how should we be thinking about affecting how other people do their work. Right? Yeah. Because if you come in with a compliance book saying, look, I wrote this process for you, it's a copy of ISO 2702 or whatever that is, you need to kind of follow this because this is what will make us compliant. Right? Yeah. You already done half the job for people to find creative ways of not listening to you. Right?
Yeah.
But the thing is, and again, it's about the trade-off, right? Because it's very easy to come up with these processes. You've got templates. You can go online in 10 minutes. You can find one of these and say, I'm going to adopt this, right?
Mm-hmm.
But and that usually means if you go down to that end of the spectrum, that means you're going to have a very hard time on affecting how work is done in your organization, but you're going to have a very easy time convincing external auditors that you're doing a good job.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
As opposed to the other end of the spectrum, which is you don't worry so much about what the specific processes that could be easily created are, but you actually go to the end of the spectrum and understand how work is being done, and you try to negotiate with those teams, like definitions of ready, definitions of done, things that are embedded within their own workflows, within the way they organize their work, and you negotiate with them how what they should be doing needs to assure the security outcomes that you as the compliance person need to evidence externally, right? And that will make once it does, it becomes very easy for your internal teams because they're going to be because they're going to be involved and they're going to create something that is appropriate to their context. But it's going to be much, much harder to convince auditors that you're doing the right thing because they're not going to be seeing the artifacts that they're used to seeing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think the job of compliance in modern organizations is really figuring out where your organization is and where you should be in this spectrum, right?
Yeah.
Between operational repeatability and operational focus and the easiness of going through an audit, right?
Yep.
And I think most organizations tend to default to making the external audit visible because we think our job is only to pass audits and not necessarily to change how people do their work. Right.
Yeah.
When we need to understand that this is a spectrum, right, and that we need to kind of figure out, where to live within that spectrum.
Yeah, I think that. So like, it makes me think of two different things. Like, so I usually think like, one of the problems with some of the ways people think about software systems right now is like there's a radical difference between scaling cat pictures per minute and scaling bank accounts access per minute, right? Like there's just like those are completely different risk profiles, right? And so like what you've got these multiple dimensions now. You've kind of got like how hard do we have to be in governing versus kind of design with is kind of the way I might refer to your second idea, right? Like the idea that what we should be doing is working with teams to have them understand certain social practices, certain processes, certain skill sets, so that they can engage creatively and usefully in the securing of the system, versus like the hard opposite, which is no, we have to be more strict than that. We can't let you, and like so that it kind of makes me think about this thing. Again, I find it to be a false dichotomy, but like the separation of concerns, the separation of duties theory, does that like how do you negotiate that if you want to design security with people? Are you now part of the team? You're not a separate auditing system anymore. Like how should people think about that?
Yep. So I don't think there are good repeatable answers yet. I think that in context, there are people that have done some pretty good job at this type of stuff. So I know people like Aaron Reinhardt, Kelly Shortridge, Fastly. There's companies that are doing this type of stuff very well, right, in achieving that balance. But I don't think we've got accepted good practices that are defined as such, that are kind of that you can kind of take it off the shelf, apply it, and replicate. Right? I don't think we're there yet. Maybe someday, but I don't think we're there. So what I think is really understanding where each organization is within their own context and what the next right thing to do is. Right? If you've got when you come out of an environment where you need to quickly introduce compliance and achieve compliance outcomes, right? I think that in that context, it pays off to kind of go the strict compliance rule and creating the processes and all of that, and kind of create a system that is robust enough to be subject to external scrutiny and pass those tests appropriately, right? I think that's kind of job number one. And look, as much as I like integrated stuff, we need to understand what our organization is and what's the next right step, right? And usually that's the next right step is kind of go more towards the spectrum of, look, we're going to have a bunch of documents, we're going to figure it out later. Right? But then when you build this system that is robust to the perturbations that you expect, largely from external B2B contracts, regulatory compliance needs that you have, then I think you've created a good framework that you can then evolve into moving from a frame of robustness to a frame of resilience, right? Where you can kind of think about different types of practices that you can extend within your context that will introduce this uncertainty into the decision making, right? So maybe you've created a security design review process. The next step is maybe how can you, if the teams are already doing good refinement sessions, if they're already doing good identification of operational constraints and how to do capacity, maybe you can attach a threat modeling sense into those activities and start getting some of the security outcomes that you used to have on a formal security design review by integrating a few simple practices within their own work, right? And maybe you can do even A/B test it. Again, product management, right? That we're missing in security. We come up with, this is the way to do this, and for the next 5 years until that person who put that system is fired and someone else comes along or they go elsewhere, no one's going to challenge the thing that was created in the name of security, right? Because we don't have this approach of product management within the things that we do.
Yeah. I mean, so it makes me think, it's another thing I tend to think a little bit about, which is like a robust system, especially when it comes to compliance issues, can only be like reflective of past experiences, right? Like, because the whole theory of a robust system is to like return as quickly to stable state again and maintain stable state. And there's all sorts of, it's very Newtonian, it's very brittle, it breaks easily, it breaks catastrophically often, things like that. Whereas a resilient system is, constantly repairing itself. It's constantly trying to create security. It's constantly trying to create a more sustainable way of working and things like this. And it's future looking because it assumes that something's going to happen that is more likely to be noticed on the leaf edge than it is to be noticed in the center, right? So that has to do with, again, kind of this idea of kind of upskilling people and helping them understand the security systems.
Not just upskilling. And so a problem that affects security, but we tend to not consider the wider effects. Actually, it's this one, compliance capitalism. Right? So we sometimes forget that regulatory regulations and certifications, etc., they come from an insurance background. Right, so that's how the practices of risk analysis emerged, and then how we get to the type of world that we have today. So the one of the consequences or one of the contributing factors that kind of creates a history, right, is that we tend to think of these things in ways that are going to help us manage what we consider risk, right, in some way, shape, or form. But those things they affect us in ways that we then need to. We're always finding ourselves in the position that we need to justify the thing that just happened, right? And we need to justify it within the frameworks that we're given to justify them. So that's usually the challenge of trying to introduce practices in organizations that are going to kind of unearth the skeletons out of the closet, so to speak, right? Because everything is very easy in a compliance framework when you've got your process and you can show you follow the process and you've got 2 or 3 action items, you close the action items and that's it done, right? And you are keep on building that robustness against certain types of perturbations, but you're not really creating the environment where people can talk about the things that if you put them on paper, you're going to have to justify them externally. So I think a lot of times that's a large part of the challenge is that on some of these practices, like learning teams, like different ways of doing incident analysis, etc., if you do them in the way that the SRE communities talk about them, etc., I think they generate organizational learning, which is something that most organizations are missing. We don't have good ways of doing that. But on the other hand, you also need to you're also making the decision that you're going to be dealing with everything that everyone may potentially think is wrong within the organization. And if that's written down, you're then probably going to have to show that to an external stakeholder and talk about it. Right? And the problem, until we have regulations that understand complexity and that introduce within the regulatory scheme that we're always learning new things we didn't know about our own systems, that just because we couldn't foresee a particular threat or that we didn't create a particular control to deal with a particular set of conditions that coupled in a way that led to a big problem, until we get to a point where none of that sees it as a problem of risk management, but just a way of being in a world that is complex, right? I think we're going to have limited advances in integrating some of these more kind of resilience inspired ways of looking at problems in organizations.
I had two thoughts, and you can either answer both or pick one. So like my first thought is this idea. I mean, it's very familiar to most operators, which is like software engineering tends to fail slowly. Like it builds up technical debt, it slows down, it bogs out, or you can't quite find the right product fit with the market or stuff like that. Defects are too high, quality's too low. But none of those things tend to be catastrophic failures. Usually, like they just tend to be like building up of bad things, accumulating pile of nonsense, coupling, spaghetti code, all those good things. Whereas security and a lot of other operational things do have kind of this, for at least for developers. If I'm a developer, I'm looking at it. It's a very catastrophic. I don't feel any of the accumulation of these small security vulnerabilities in the system. It doesn't bother me at all. It's not anything I notice. And then the failure tends to be quite like snap and catastrophic, right? It's like and kind of like the threat modeling version of that is like kind of trying to understand that it's a series of small vulnerabilities that causes the problem, not like just one big back door that they open up, right? So when you think about that, and you think about like helping developers and platform engineers understand security better, is part of it just making like security more visible and observable to them? Is it just helping them to actually see the system in a way that they can't quite see, so that it's not quite so catastrophic?
So going first to your point, I think the things are ultimately all observable. The reason why I think, and I've got the same perception that in software engineering things to take a bit longer. It's because I think it's because of materiality, right? Because all of those small things, they are usually things we can touch, right? It's that system that has a very long SQL queries that sometimes bogs down the other thing, or it's right. There's materiality to it. We can point and we can say those things. Usually in most organizations that so I've been through 3 or 4 data breaches in organizations through my career. It's something that kind of comes up all the time, is usually before things start going wrong, the signs are there, but they're embedded in the socio-technical system, not in so much the things that are material that we can point to and do that. It's usually more embedded within decision making, with how people are making trade-off decisions, how if they are considering the trade-off decisions. That's one of the reasons why. Before I joined my current employer, I was working for about 5 years as a consultant, and this is something that I used to tell them. There's a significant problem in creating if you're a startup. I think it's usually problematic if you start creating a security team too soon. Right? As opposed to thinking about getting some external help, for instance, from a consultant to help design a work system, that the work system itself assures the security outcomes. Because if too early in a startup you get 1 or 2 security people that are the security people, everyone else will just hand over work. When it comes to security question, it's look, you throw it over the fence to them, and they'll tell you if you can go on or not. So they're not going to be developing the muscle memory, right, to actually think about security as part of their role, as opposed to if you get some external support, some interim support of people building good work systems, then 5 years down the line, 3 years down the line, when you actually create, you're not starting from scratch, and you're starting with a foundation of people that are used to thinking about security in doing their own work, right? And this is something that happens a lot.
It's like you're kind of like talking about like de-skilling of the organization by creating a specialty too early. That's interesting. So my other thought was kind of more related to the compliance observations you made. So like Decker talks about this quite a bit. He talks about the way that kind of insurance and legalization of pilots in particular is his concern, causes an unfair view of the pilot, that the pilot can be at fault, right? And that they hold all the fault as an individual as opposed to like as an organization or socio-technical system failure. And one of the things that I've seen kind of working around security people is this weird version of a similar thing, which is people don't want to be legally tagged as being potentially knowing of something that could have been a security breach. And so it's almost like the world's worst version of skeletons in the closet, because literally people are like, do not show me those skeletons. I do not want to know that they exist, because I don't want to be legally responsible for them. So you have these weird, like all these security conversations almost have to happen in like a back room where nobody's listening and you're talking directly to somebody. How do we get around that in organizations? How do we like start making that kind of dynamic less present?
No, that's a good question. So I think most of the time, the problem starts with a lack of common language, right? Typically, when you've got people that come from governance, risk, and compliance functions, we have a very particular type of language, right? It's all about deficit, it's about control, it's about non-compliances, it's all negative, right? We count all of the negatives and we try to manage all of the negatives, right? When we go talk to engineers, they're getting their input mainly from product teams, right, in terms of what they're building. So their language is all about the positives, is what this will do for our clients, how much revenue this may bring, etc. And and then these people need to somehow collaborate together, right? And they've got a language that is completely at odds with each other, right? So I think usually one of the first things that I try to do, and one of the reasons why when I build teams, I like to hire people with different types of backgrounds, right? People that have had a QA background, people that have had a legal background, people that have. So I like to social science background, right? That I have now. So I usually try to bring people that can bring in kind of these different perspectives, that understand the world, the world of our stakeholders, not from the point of view of this is what the security in it should look like, but I actually understand the trade-offs and constraints because I used to make them myself. Right? And I think for me that is one of the first steps in how we are hiring. And not only that, how we are training people to perform their jobs, right? I don't think we're making in good enough use as an industry of things such as shadowing, of going to work in customer care for a month or two, right? To kind of understand what the work is. I think if we're going to move as a GRC industry, I think we need to figure out. Look, I'm not one of those saying everyone needs to be technical in a GRC function, right? That's not going to happen, and I don't think that's necessarily useful. But I do think that people need to understand what does a developer do when they submit code, right? Maybe I can sit down with a few of them. They can explain. So if healthy interactions between engineering and compliance functions are relationships where you can say, look, I don't know how that works. Can you show me? Right, and the person is going to say, let me show him the bare minimum, because he may then want to affect how I'm doing my work, but more, okay, let me show you. Right? Let's spend half an hour on a Slack huddle, and I'll show you how this thing actually works. Right? And again, it becomes with the relationship. It starts with the relationships. Right?
Yeah. So like again, like another term from resilience engineering land, which is this idea of common ground, which I think is
Yeah.
close to what you're describing, right? Which is this, the way that I try to explain sometimes is in an organization, you want diversity of thought
Yep.
and observation of the system and management of the system. Like it's good to have diversity. Like in fact, you kind of like have a requisite variety needed in the system in order
Hmm.
to stabilize it. And then there's this other version that I like to call requisite coherence, which is like, but the organization still has to stick together. It can't be
Yep.
literally separate parts that are all just like looking at the elephant from different perspectives. So you have to have this idea of common ground, and 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 I usually say that common ground is just having enough shared idea. Some language is part of it, but like
Hmm.
when you look at somebody across the hallway and you see what they're doing, it's not that even that you say, I think they're doing the right thing, but it is saying, I generally understand that they're not doing something crazy or stupid, right? Like
Yep.
that I can understand that they have some rationale and that if I needed to, I could go over there and have a conversation because I generally get what's happening over there. So I always think that's an interesting kind of way of trying to
Yep.
figure out how to develop an organization's
Yeah, which becomes
capacity.
increasingly difficult, right? So when you mentioned that, it reminded me of David Woods, so from Resilience Engineering, and his law of fluency, right?
Yeah, yeah,
That largely states that expertise hides effort, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
it's very easy to see an expert at their job, and it just seems like it's easy, like they're not making decisions, but actually they are making lots of trade-offs. But because they are experienced, they are making them on the go, right? They don't need to make them explicit for someone else to see, right?
yeah,
And that's the problem with them. We trade off decisions and expertise. That it's usually very hard for you. You probably can't codify it, or if you
yeah,
can, it's going to lose its value very quickly. And second, if you're looking as an external observer and you don't intimately understand the things that is going on, you're going to miss it anyway, right?
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, it gets back to this like again, the conversation seems to be revolved around this, which I like, but it gets back to this idea. Like sometimes people will say like you have to have 100% unit test coverage, which is a terrible one, or the other one is you have to have a certain like extremely high level of uptime, or like all these kind of like extreme versions um, of being in compliance
yep,
or being capable of it. All of which again, uh, you know, for instance, unit testing. If you teach people they have to unit test every method, uh, they will fail to understand the value of unit testing very
yep,
quickly because they will not, because half the time they will be doing useless unit testing and they will just learn that most unit testing, literally most unit testing, if you have 100% compliance, most of the unit tests you wrote are not useful.
yep,
um, and so there's like this weird balance that we're trying to, I think we're pointing out here, which has to do with like automate everything versus automate the right things in
yep,
order to keep the people who are involved in the system engaged and working within the system. So you're like lowering certain load, heightening other load, like shifting stuff around.
mm,
um, so I think it's just an interesting problem to think through. And I hadn't really thought about it from a security perspective, but it seems to be similar. Yeah.
yeah, it is. So again, that's another problem that we are increasingly having, particularly when it comes to risk quantification. So I think risk quantification has a role to play, as does qualitative risk assessment, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think we, as an industry, we need to figure out where we should be using each, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But a big problem of that type of metric chasing, right? It's the same thing I think in engineering as it is in security, right? Which the problem is not the number. The problem is the ontological alchemy that we expect from achieving those numbers, right? That
Yeah.
we say, look, it. Using an example with weight loss, look, I'm going to be really happy when I'm 170 pounds, right?
Yep.
Or etc. And then we reach that number and nothing really changed. You're still the same person from
Yep.
171 to 169. There
Yep.
was no magic, right?
Yep.
And we keep up. trying to build all of these contextual dynamics in organizations, trying to, we need to achieve that thing, that number, that we end up making trade-off decisions between. Unit testing is a good example, because you're creating tech that in your code at twice the rate. Right? So testing is also code, right? They need to be managed, they need to be nurtured, they need to be reviewed, right? So it's those that, we expect too much of ontological alchemy, and we put too much weight behind particular numbers, thinking that we're all going to be happy and very efficient when those numbers are achieved.
Yeah, I mean, something like, so I have this weird version of this which is when I think about numbers, I tend to think about it this way. Like, I say to people, like, if you close your eyes and you think like you're sitting on a big horse and you've got a big knife and there's a very large lizard in front of you, what do? Right? And people go, oh, like, that's George and the Dragon, and like, so I'm going to fight with the dragon, and I'm a knight. Like, they can get that picture really quickly.
Yep.
And so I like to point out to people that the way that I just told you the story went from things to narrative. It didn't go from narrative to things. We didn't start in a narrative context and find the things. You started from things and you found the narrative, right? And this is one of the problems, I think, with overly numeric approaches, is they're all things. And because they're such general things, numbers, they can fit into many, many narratives. And therefore, having numbers in the organization does not guarantee everybody's looking at anything the same, because the narrative is what gives it sense and makes sense to people. And the narrative, there's a bunch of different narratives that can fit. They just like radically underdetermine the narrative structure that goes with them. So you kind of almost have to like have some sort of qualitative narrativization of any kind of, I think, any sort of metric structure for people to even begin to make any sense of it, if you expect them to make the same sense of it, right?
Yep. So numbers look more scientific, right? And that's the problem.
Absolutely right.
There's a lot of things that would be better approached with storytelling, and thus capturing narratives across the organization, selecting kind of outliers and kind of analyzing some of those outlier narratives, etc. I'm sure there would usually be much more learning that could be done from that, but it's just easier to slap a number on something and then make up the story that we want to tell with it.
Yep. I mean, so it reminds me very much of like John Allspaw's arguments about like the way that kind of incident reporting goes, right? He basically says a good incident report makes people more curious about the system. It doesn't tell them the answer of what went wrong, because that will make them uninterested in the system, right? Like it's a way of creating, again, the right level of engagement, the right level of ambiguity, the right level of pointing at there's still something there, or again, the system went wrong this way, but like something allowed that to happen, and we haven't kind of fully identified that yet. All those types of kind of ways of thinking about, again, engagement in a system from a social perspective.
And even from an incident response. So there's recent research, something called SCAD, Systemic Contributor Analysis Diagram, that actually picks up on some of those, I think, ideas from Allspaw and others in the space, which is, and I think it's very relevant to security, because particularly in the context of data breaches, it's very easy for us to say, to go make our objective analysis and come up with, it was that person that did not click that button, or that led to these three other things, and that was the end of it, right? That's usually easy in how the incident response and incident learning happens, but actually we know that there were conditions that led to people to making the adaptations that they made, and that were business pressures that led to those conditions that so the one thing that we often forget in security investigations, etc., is that the people doing it have the power to decide when the story starts. That's right. Does it start when the person clicked the thing on the thing clicking thing, or does it start with the different types of pressures and the business conditions that and conflicting goals that are left to the front line to try and entangle all of the different demands that come from all of the different areas of the organization at the same time, right?
Yeah, and like one of the things I've always thought about like that, especially with like Allspa's version of it and kind of resilience engineering version of it is, I totally understand. I mean, I agree with almost all of this that Allspa has to say about it. But one of the things I tend to think about it is like one of the reasons I think it happens the way it does right now is because incident reports, I think originally were literally reports up the executive stack, and the CTO or the CEO does not want an answer where it's like, we figured out what happened this time, but there's all this vagueness that we should continue to explore and continue. They have a PR firm on the phone. They have a lawyer on the phone. They want an absolute root cause
Closure.
that you have. That's what they want. They don't want any of this other nonsense.
No.
And it's partially, again, because they're not using the incident report for the same thing that we're describing, right? They're using it to manage the kind of reputational damage, legal damage, and that's a different kind of game.
And I think that's part of the interim approaches that we need to figure out within organizations, which is how can we keep on satisfying the needs of the external constituents and our external stakeholders, whilst creating an environment that internally people can talk about stuff. And if that means that we need to have two separate processes and one somehow contributing to the other, and we kind of articulate what those differences are, then maybe that's what we need to do. What we shouldn't do is just accept that everything that we need to do needs to be in service of the external stakeholders, because we know that it's going to affect psychological safety, how people deal with their environment, how much they're willing to learn from the things that happen internally. That will over time actually decrease your resilience, right? We know there's enough research to say that's the type of stuff that decreases resilience. So I think we need to it's the context in figuring out how can we have interim things that are not maybe what we, and I see this in frustration in a lot of the SRE community, that we're all learning about all of these things, and then once we go into a business and start trying to implement them, we get everyone saying, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that. That's not going to work.
Are you the one who's going to tell my product manager that we're going to stop developing features and start developing operational concerns? Because I can't. I've tried that a bunch of times. They don't listen to me.
Nope.
So I like again, kind of bring it back to the platform thing based on what you just were talking about a little bit. There's this like kind of memish thing going around. It's like platform as a product, right? Which to me is kind of like managing a platform like a product and trying to satisfy developers. And again, in my view of it, right, is that I think a platform is different than a product, and B, I don't think most people know how to manage products very well anyway. So like telling them to manage their platform like a product is like not all that helpful in my mind. But finally, it seems to be like based on a lot of like developer supremacy theory, right? Like that the developer is the primary customer, and you need to do that. So getting back a little bit to what you were saying, like being only focused on this particular user of the system, it continues to surprise me that after the amount of conversations we've had in the DevOps community about platforms and the SRE community about platforms, and the fact that we keep on pointing at like the operators are also users of this system, we still have to keep pointing this out that no, security people, operators, all these other people are also consumers of the system you're building. It's not just the developers, right? So, I mean, what do you think? What do you think about kind of this idea of product as a platform as a product idea?
So, I think ultimately, again, thinking about the path dependence that we have as an industry. So security has traditionally been understood as the school of no, right? You can't do that. You need to, it's going to take a long time. And now I need to put it in the Security Enterprise Review Board, and they meet once every 3 months. So I'm going to have to wait until they figure out their stuff before I get my feedback if I can do something, right? So again, that's one kind of end of the spectrum. Um, I when security teams build security capabilities in ways that can be kind of consumed as platform, and when we associate with it and make it easy to do the things that we need to do to evidence the security outcomes that we need for assurance, that's kind of the where I want to get to. Right? It's not just I'm going to stop everything and make things because the economics is going to be on development team. If I as security am affecting the economics of software development in the organization, I'm going to get asked a lot of questions, right? And I'm going to have to justify that very well, right? Because usually the economics are associated with that. Right? So I think they definitely need to be one of the key stakeholders that we, and as users, as the first line of defense, let's call it, of software creation. I think we do need to have some kind of kind of subordination to their function in terms of the how they can evidence the security outcomes we need to do. Right? So things such as can they understand the outputs of security tools? Can they manage false positives? Do they know how to open policy exceptions? Do I, as a security function, can aggregate the results of the vulnerability stuff that happens in CI/CD and articulate risks to the product owners? Right, and to the business people, right? So as long as we create things that can probably have that subordination as a baseline, but on top of it, kind of can extract the information that then allows other stakeholders to make informed decisions within the scope of their own remit. Right. I think to me that's the view to have, not necessarily drop everything and make developers' lives easy, but how can I integrate such that the other things on how that touches decision making and risk management in other places of the organization? How can I make it as seamless as possible so that I don't have the friction of adding economic constraints to the role of software creation in the organization?
Yeah, so like in a related kind of thought in my mind. So there's this, obviously there's a huge conversation about shifting left for all sorts of quality concerns, and security is a quality concern, right? Like you can't, we could probably say you can't inspect security in to some level. I think that's part of what we've been talking about to some extent. So it used to be like architects, right? Were like these people over there who made pictures and diagrams, and then they gave them to other people and they say, you have to do these things now. Or they inspected the outcomes, right? And then they figured out what was wrong with them and asked people to re-architect things and things like this. But it seems like there's this movement in more sophisticated organizations where it's not just shift left, it's actually shift left and then in prod, right? And what I mean by in prod is in operation. So like to me, an SRE is an architect who happens to be like working on operational architecture, not like theoretical architecture. So like one of the movements in the big movements has been moving from organizations managing code, literally software, to organizations managing services or operational systems, right? And this is a big shift, right? So from a security perspective, do we need to train the operators how to like observe operational security? Like, or because in a lot of places that I've seen, right, it's like, again, we got a security team over there. That team just is an inspection and report writing team. They give a bunch of reports over to other teams and they say, like, here's where you're in or out of violation to different things. Fix this, fix that. But is there like this need for a role that's more like, no, this is a person who's like observing the system constantly in operation, thinking about it in operation, not just from a kind of, again, like static code analysis.
So I think there's again, I think we see a lot of different ways to approach that problem in organizations. So on the shift left side of it, I think a good pattern that has emerged probably mostly in the last 10 years or so, was the creation of product security teams, right? Where you've got security engineers potentially that they embed themselves within work of particular kind of clusters or business units or product areas, and they provide a lot of that support on how to look at tools, how to manage from all of that. Then in other organizations, kind of more recently, and particularly now as we get more nodes, right, more assets, we used to have kind of 5 servers. Now we've got 500 containers running on a pod, right, or something along those lines. So the amount of things to look at has increased exponentially, generally speaking. So I think that functions in the pattern that I've seen, which is a pattern that we're also implementing at where I work right now, has to do with having teams that do 2 things. First, the areas around detection engineering. So people kind of correlating information from multiple things, creating high fidelity alarming systems so that can support the operators in doing operations. And on the other hand, also functions that do more proactive attack surface management and vulnerability management, where they may have the skills to actually attempt exploitation of a particular vulnerability to see how exposed they might to this, right? And factor that into how you approach then escalations for product teams to do vulnerability management type activities. So I think product security as a pattern to support the build side of things, in detection engineering, in the attack surface management, / vulnerability management to support the role of operators, usually ways that I see are good patterns for security functions to kind of support both parts of that equation.
So you've been very generous through your time. So I have one more question, and we'll get towards the end here. But like, it's, to me, one of the questions that comes to mind in listening to you talk is like, there's kind of a classic kind of red team, blue team activity that's kind of this like active engagement trying to secure the system. But one of the things I've heard more and more people talk about is kind of purple teaming, which is like the idea that the red team should sit with the blue team and explain how the vulnerabilities work, and how, it's not just like a random attack and a random defense. It's like an actual kind of, let's examine the system together. I'll help you understand how I'm attacking. You help me understand how you're defending. We'll both learn a little bit from each other. Have you seen that kind of idea of purple teaming? How does it fit with some of your other ideas?
Yeah, so I think there's a big problem of scale in all of that, right? Because usually in organizations, it's very easy. You see a lot of people having kind of the concept of red teams, etc., and doing some of the other work. And again, going back to one of my initial problems, when you've put yourself in a hole as a blue teamer, as a blue team function, right? When you've put yourself in a work where paperwork begets paperwork, there's no way you're getting out of that mess so you can actually support a purple team type engagement, because you're going to be so down in the management of paperwork and potentially have so many resources and people, headcount already to manage the paperwork begets paperwork side of the house. That's probably not going to be an affordance provided to you in the context that you have. Right? So I think it works really well when you've got the opportunity to kind of build both functions from scratch and create these dynamics and these social practices that kind of bring those things together. Trying to do that in an already moving boat where you potentially have never done red teaming. So there's a lot of stuff that will be on coming up, and you're going to have the issues with backlog management and how they get prioritized and how the narratives that happen there, or a traditional blue team that found themselves in this paperwork narrative and dynamics that it's going to be very hard to justify additional resources to actually do this purple teaming. I think it becomes really complicated. So I think it's a good idea. It's even the idea that was behind the rugged manifesto, so which I really like his work as well. But I think I haven't seen very well, and maybe it's just my lack of experience, but a path to get to a point where that's efficient, right? Given a starting point, how you kind of transition your organization to that effectively. It's something that I've never seen.
Yeah, I think so. Like it points again to me to one of the kind of like things that we notice about platforms more generally, which is we try to tell people, if you're running any organization that has any kind of cloud nativeness to it, so you got containers or maybe serverless or some of these ideas are running around your organizations where you're doing deployments quite frequently. Uh, you may not be aware that you have a platform, but you definitely have a platform because there's no way to manage the system without some sort of platform. It just might be that you have paper platform. In other words, you have a lot of bureaucracy that is your platform, right?
Yep.
Or sometimes we call them Soylent platforms from Soylent Green.
Yep.
Your platform is made of people who are like keeping it up, right? And so it seems to me like another example of an argument for like getting platforms right, freeing up time and energy and focus for these kind of security activities, making the cycle times fast enough that you could reasonably do them within a couple of days instead of spending 6 months setting up for your tabletop and then whatever.
Yep. Yep.
So that's interesting. What are three takeaways we should leave people with from this? Three ideas that
Yep.
you think
Yep.
are important.
So I think before thinking about integrating with kind of security services in platform, I think the issue of how we're going to manage it as a product, I think is a useful idea. Particularly in the context of security functions, traditionally thinking more in waterfall. We deploy control. Now here's the widget. You keep on doing your thing, and I'm going to keep on doing mine, or I'm going to go on to building the next widget to make available to you. But having this concept of product management on how we integrate things in, it's a step in the right direction, I think, generally. The other idea that we talked about a lot is context switching kills productivity, right? And joy. Right. So when we think about a lot of these capabilities, we really need to think about what's the minimum viable security knowledge that people need to have in order to use the things that we are exposing to them as platform capabilities. And the last one would be not overlooking the social networks. Right, we have this problem in security where it's all people, process, and technology, but the people is just you send them to a training course, and that's the people's stuff dealt with, and not so much the social aspect of how we are engaging, how we're eliciting feedback, how we are making ourselves available in a way that people actually want to talk with us, right? And that's something that usually is forgotten or not considered in how we do security stuff.
It just makes me smile because back when I was young and I lived in New York, and I hung out with security people, I think we all knew that the main way to penetrate any system was social engineering. I mean, it was also like once you got into certain areas, you'd have to have some skills to get break out of this box and get into that. But like the first step was always social engineering. But anyway. What's one thing that people can do to support your work or learn more about what you want to do, learn more about security differently?
Yeah. So my blog, securitydifferently.com. So I haven't been doing, I still keep on doing a bit of blogging, but I want to get a bit more into that. So if you know of any places that would like to have me, like this podcast, etc., I'm always very happy. It's easier to talk than it is to write these days. There's a lot of stuff happening at work. But yeah, I think those would be kind of the main things.
Well, I'd love to have you back, and I will also tell everybody out there
I'd love
that
to be back.
A great guest, and they should have you on their podcast too. It was a great time. It was nice to be able to talk with you, Mario.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
I'll talk to you later, man. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.